Alright, let's get started on our practice test. So we're going to list all the characteristics or the properties of parallelograms. Draw them on an example. I'm probably going to have a couple drawings, that way it doesn't get too cluttered. So the first thing that we know about a parallelogram is that the opposite sides are parallel. So this is what makes a shape a parallelogram. Opposite sides are parallel. The next thing is that the opposite sides are congruent. So the opposite sides are congruent. The next is the opposite angles are congruent. The next property is the consecutive angles add to 180 degrees. So these two angles, the ones that are touching here, they add and make 180 degrees. Consecutive just means that they're next to each other. Well, these two angles will also add to 180 degrees. And then you can actually work your way around. These two angles add to 180, these two angles add to 180. So the consecutive angles are supplementary. They add to 180. And the last one we're going to look at is the diagonals. So the diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. Now there's one I also like to add, is that the diagonals create alternate interior angles. So that means that this angle is congruent to this one. And this angle is going to be congruent to this one. And then you can also add them here. So the diagonals create alternate interior angles. Now for a rectangle, the first thing is a rectangle is just a parallelogram. So everything that was true for a parallelogram is also true for a rectangle. So that means that the opposite sides are congruent, the opposite angles are congruent, that the diagonals bisect each other. So I'm not going to restate all that and redraw that. You can see that in the above example. So let's look at what makes a rectangle. And so what's going to make it a rectangle is that we have 4 right angles. And I like to say it's a parallelogram with 4 Alright, so again, since we said it's a parallelogram, everything that's true about a parallelogram is also true about a rectangle. So I'm not going to rewrite everything. But the one special property that's unique, or which stands out for a rectangle, is that the diagonals are congruent. So that means that segment MT is going to be congruent to segment AH. Now for a square, I want to still remember that a square is going to have the same properties as a parallelogram. And the same as a rectangle. So that means that the opposite sides are congruent. That means the diagonals bisect each other. So everything that was true for a parallelogram is also true for a square. And then for the rectangle, remember we learned that the diagonals are congruent. So that means the diagonals of a square are also congruent. Alright, so now let's look at what makes a rectangle. Or I'm sorry, a square. And so a square has the 4 right angles like a rectangle. But what makes it a square is that all 4 sides are congruent. So I like to say that a square is basically a rectangle. That way you remember that it has the same properties. Is a rectangle with 4 congruent sides. Now, this isn't going to be an easy one for me to draw, but we'll see what happens. One of the things that's special about a square are the diagonals. Now we already know that they're congruent. We already know that they bisect each other. But when they cross, they make a right angle. So the diagonals are perpendicular. Now another thing that diagonals do is that the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. And since we know the angles of 90 degrees, we actually know that this is going to be 45, and that would happen in every angle of the square.